Bien,
Well, hello everyone, and welcome once again to the Marguerite de Navarre Auditorium, where it is with great pleasure, as every summer we rediscover the quality of heating, especially with the Siberian cold we are experiencing. Please allow me, first of all, it may be a bit late, but nevertheless, I'd like to present my very best sincere wishes for this new year 2013. The last time we were here, it was just a few days before my husband deceased. He fought all the way with a courage and dignity that were unwavering despite the unimaginable suffering in his battle against cancer, which finally won the day. It is thanks to my husband, I must say, and he will forever be my best friend and my life companion over 30 years. It is thanks to him that I was able to begin my lectures this year at the start of 2013, whereas he was doing very badly, and it was also thanks to him that I resume my lectures today, even though he is no longer here. More than ever before, I must admit that our Thursday lectures are for me the only door for the time being opening on to life. So I would sincerely like to thank you from deep in my heart for always being so loyal and faithful in your attendance despite the unexpected events in recent weeks. I don't know how you were able to keep up to date with respect to announcements and cancellations of announcements of lectures, but I would like to thank all of you who expressed their sympathy and encouragement in one way or another. If I'm standing or sitting before you today with these dark glasses, please believe that it's not to act like a star. It's quite simply because of an inflammation of both eyes. And as if by chance, it occurred exactly the day after my husband's funeral, and it was then aggravated by an allergy to the treatment itself. And this inflammation therefore prevents me from reading properly, and this has been the case for the past 3 weeks. I must say that it was then that I realized how important and how vital eyes are for our profession. I do hope that you will not hold it against me if I am still clearly handicapped in my reading, and if today's lecture is even more hesitant than usual. 1 month ago, we were working on the history behind the deconstruction process of the text of the Liu, which is generally translated into English as the Analects of Confucius, and also the character Confucius himself. A deconstruction process, therefore, which was quite erratic, so to speak, and that took place during the long period over several centuries, but the deconstruction process accelerated in recent decades due to two movements. On the one hand, the archaeological discoveries, in particular, of textual corpuses that were hitherto unknown, and also due to a new methodological approach to the texts. And as we have seen, it was largely inspired by biblical textual criticism methods developed, in particular, in German Protestant theological environment since the 19th century. These two factors force us to radically change our way of looking at the texts. Predominantly European and modern tradition has accustomed us to viewing the text as an essay or a continuous literary work due to a single author, or at least that may be attributed to a school. That was our European and modern conception of a text. That does not mean that this type of text could not exist in ancient China. Nevertheless, it seems quite likely that it was not the norm. We have seen that traditional Chinese terminology applied to ancient textual sources uses as a unit not the book as we know of it here today, but rather the pian, which you have here with this character, and we saw in this character, I can't see the arrow, but anyway, it's the first character you have at the top of the slide. So we saw, therefore, that the written form for this character indicates that it was probably a bundle of bamboo strips. Where's my arrow? Here it is. So at the top of the character, you find this part that is normally referred to as the key or the radical, and here this is the radical or key for bamboo. Underneath you can recognize a schematic drawing, let's say, of laths or strips of bamboo that are bounded together by a cord going around it, whereas these strips are laid out vertically. Let me remind you of what these manuscripts look like, the manuscripts that were recently founded in tombs, thanks to archaeological excavations carried out over some 30 years. And here you can see what these strips look like. They're vertical with a column of characters per strip. Let me take this opportunity to also show you how these same strips are dealt with by archaeologists and epigraphists in charge of deciphering and reading the text written. So you can see in a darker color, at least I see them as a darker color, these bamboo strips, the same ones, and just beside you find the transcription in modern Chinese characters. For many of these texts, these transcriptions are still quite hypothetical, since obviously the written forms have, after all, changed since 2,000 plus years. So you can see how they work on these bamboo strips. Let me now come back to this pian, which is what one could call the basic unit in what we refer to as a book. It is not quite a chapter, even though, according to custom, pian is translated as chapter. But a book is therefore apparently composed of pian, which are in their turn subdivided into cheng, the second character you have on the slide. These cheng are in turn formed of phrases or members or groups of phrases that are relatively short. A cheng may be, for example, a section. In the Luyu, meaning the Analects of Confucius, or it could be a verse. In the Lao Tzu, let me show you straight away an example that we will come back to. For example, you have a verse from Lao Tzu 64, and just below you have a section in the Lun Yu, or the book, or pian number 1 and cheng number 9. Let me remind you that the Analects of Confucius, the Lu Yu, according to conventions adopted in general by Western sinologists, the pian, or what we call chapters, are referred to with Roman characters, and the cheng are referred to using Arabic numerals. If we were to compare different textual sources, we would realize that some cheng, which are in a way the basic units forming the overall text, these cheng are found in different contexts where they take on different meanings. And these textual units are called by different terms or expressions which we generally find in English. For example, you have the sinologist. Let me try to find my list of names. So the American sinologist, the second name you have on the slide, William Boltz, who speaks about movable units. Movable units, therefore. Or he also speaks of building blocks. Building blocks that remind us of cubes you find in construction games that we give to our very young children. Another American sinologist, and his name is just below, Edward Shaughnessy. Let me seize this opportunity straight away to announce that Professor Shaughnessy from the University of Chicago should be coming to the Collège de France to give a series of 4 lectures precisely on these ancient texts, and that will be given in June 2013. Edward Shaughnessy, he speaks of pericopes. Pericopes, therefore, in Greek, this means cutting around in the Greek language. In French, the word is feminine. This pericope is used more specifically in the exegesis of sacred texts or in liturgy. In this context, this is a part of a text forming a unit, forming a whole in itself, or a coherent thinking that may be interpreted critically in exegesis or for public reading in liturgy, for example. You may recall that the last time, meaning about 1 month ago already, we were here together and we read an example of a pericope taken from the Gospel of John at the very beginning of John 8. So a very well-known pericope that has largely been studied by Christian theologists, the pericope of the adulterous woman. The adulterous woman, a very well-known story that led to the expression that has become commonplace, throwing the first stone. So this pericope, it just so happens that it does not appear in the manuscripts of the oldest, most ancient Gospels. According to some specialists, it originally was not even in the Gospel according to John. So I will not launch out into any of this issue at great length, which is more relevant to our colleagues working on Christian texts. But at any rate, there is clearly a doubt which persists as regards the authenticity of this pericope. When I say authenticity, I'm referring to a direct relationship with a historical Jesus. The last lecture, I announced that we would be facing the same type of problem regarding Confucius, the historical character, and his ties with everything he's reported to have said. And of course, we are more particularly interested in this point, everything that we have seen in the Luyu and that is reported to have been said by Confucius. So, a priori, there are doubts about the authenticity of what is reported to have said. Now, based on the examples given by the German sinologist Matthias Richter, and you have his name which comes forth on this list. So this is a German sinologist, as a matter of fact, a sinologist from East Germany who's currently lecturing in the United States, like many of his German colleagues, who are unable to find enough jobs in Germany, which is highly regrettable. So many of these colleagues end up in the United States. According to Matthias Richter, we can see how these movable units that are extremely concise, such as for character expressions, as you can see here, in this verse from Lao Tzu 6-4, which I just showed you. So Matthias Richter was able to show to us how these mobile units could be a part of a common foundation reused in different contexts that can vary while preserving a similar formulation apart from a few variants. So these mobile units take on a very different meaning and of a different dimension in some cases, to such an extent that these mobile textual units were even compared to loose leaves that you can put in a binder, where you can add or remove as needed, and you can change the order at will. You saw that the material presentation of these expressions on the bamboo strips, which were initially separate from each other, and we could say that each would carry a cheng or one of these mobile units, so they can therefore be shuffled around truly at will, because in actual fact the order may be altered, changed very, very easily. Let me remind you that these strips are just bound by a cord that's about 1/3 way down. So here a cord and another one a bit lower down. You can therefore see that the material presentation is perfectly suitable to an analogy with a set of loose sleeves in a binder. Let me show you this example given by Matthias Richter. I eliminated from this slide all the other occurrences of what you have in Lao Tzu 64, meaning the 4-character expression that we can see on the slide. Here it is, 4 characters forming a sort of maxim, a very general maxim of wisdom that can be adapted to every situation, so to speak, and which means, quite simply, let there be a careful attention. It can be an injunction, therefore. Let there be a careful attention to the end, the cheng, just as much as at the beginning. In other words, you must be attentive, pay attention to the entire process. Today we would say from start to finish, but here this is a piece of advice to be vigilant when the process comes to its end, just as you were vigilant at the very beginning. And I believe that obviously this is what you could call one of the Chinese maxims of wisdom we find everywhere, and that are reported in general to have been said by Confucius, left and right. But let me draw your attention to how true this maxim is. We have seen many times French sportsmen crying victory a little bit too early and falling apart just at the very end. In other words, as they get to the finish line, they fall off their bicycles or whatever. So this is the trivial context for which one could think of this maxim. The rest of the phrase says that if you do this, if you pay attention at the end, just like you were attentive at the beginning of the process, then here we have a negative, then there will be no 败事, meaning activity where you will fail. In other words, you will not know failure. Now this maxim in 4 characters, you can find it with a variant. In section 9, cheng 9 of Bian 1, the first book, we would say, of the Luyu. And here the maxim is placed in the mouth of Zhengzi, meaning Master Zheng, who was supposed to have been a disciple of Confucius, and for once we do not have the canonical formula saying the master says. We often assume that the master referred to Confucius himself. Here it's master son says. What does he say? He comes back to the beginning of this maxim. We know that the rest of the formula is a variant of the Lao Tzu maxim. Now, if I were to translate what he says very literally, it would read, pay attention at the end, while continuing your course very far. And the rest of the cheng tells us, therefore, that the virtues of the people, and then we have ho, meaning thickness, consistence. The virtue of the people will come back to something of consistence. Of course, this literal translation does not mean very much. But what is interesting is to note that many commentators of this mobile unit in the Luyu interpret this section from a ritualist perspective, which therefore changes its meaning quite radically as compared to the general aspect of the maxim we find in Lao Tzu 64. In this ritualist context, this phrase, reported to have been said by the disciple Maître Zhen, applies to the prince, to the sovereign, ordering, giving him instructions to see to it that they pay tribute to those who were there at the end, cheng, in other words, to the deceased parents. And they must see to it that they go up all the way up to their ancestors, to go very far in their genealogy, in their filiation, all the way up to their ancestors. And it is under this condition that the virtue of the people, the people's morality, will once again become consistent. This is a concept we often find in the Analects by Confucius. If the sovereign himself sets the example, the people will follow by itself. In other words, the people would become moral all by itself. Now, our German colleagues, German but living and working in the United States, give us examples where more or less consciously they apply techniques that were tried and tested on the biblical corpus. Now, this consists more particularly in comparing the text to draw from that recurrent textual units in an attempt to replace these units in their original context, in what they refer to, or what German theologians refer to as Sitz im Leben, meaning setting in life, the life context. In other words, the real context that would allow them to rediscover a meaning that was partly or entirely concealed by the fact of having these textual units in corpuses that lead them to say something else. I gave you this example. It may not be the most convincing, but you all know that the Lao Tzu, conventionally, is attached to a category of texts that were hastily labeled to be Taoist, whereas the Lunyu is supposed to, by definition, represent the Confucius school or trend. Popular thinking consider that the Taoists and Confucians are totally opposed, but that vision of things is a vision that we will re-examine entirely. But at any rate, we can see how we have the reintegration of textual units, such as this four-character expression, reintegrated in a context on a different Sitz im Leben, and therefore leading it to say something totally different. You should also note, and this is something that we examined last year, that the material media for these textual units may be extremely variable. So far, we primarily spoke about texts or inscriptions in handwritten texts, manuscripts, but you can have unexpected media, surprising media. For example, these tile caps dating back to the Han period between the 2nd century BC and the 2nd century after Jesus Christ. The Han dynasty lasted for 4 centuries and symmetrically overlapping the beginning of the Christian era. So we can see on these tile caps called watan in Chinese, we can see for example here, this character, and here is the stamping on the left-hand side of this slide, and the transcription in modern Chinese characters just beside it. It may be read in 2 ways, with 2 different meanings. It may be ye, meaning music, or le, meaning pleasure or joy. Here, in the Han context, I believe that it's more likely that this character refers to music, ritual music, associated with the li, meaning rites, rituals, or you could also have these tile caps bearing different formulae with 4 characters in particular, which are extremely moralizing. On this slide, you have the stamping of one of these tile caps. Let me come back briefly to how these tile caps, what these tile caps look like. In fact, these tile caps, or these pieces of round bricks. That's what you find at the end of the alignment of tiles, and therefore on the edge of the roof. So these tile caps, and here you have a miniature representation of a house in the Han period, found as a funeral object in a tomb. So here you have the tile caps that are clearly meant to be seen or even read from the outside when looking at the house. So you then see these caps. And now let me come back to my stamping. So you have 4 characters transcribed on the right-hand side of the slide in modern Chinese once again, and which says the following. They're laid out like this. Where's my arrow? Ah, there. Lü Yi. Okay, it reads like this. So, these are 2 notions that are an eminent part of the Confucian vocabulary, meaning the sense of the human and the just. Things come about by themselves. It's not only a moral ideal, but it is also a political ideal, as was the case for the phrase placed in the mouth of Master Cheng, which you just read in the Lun Yu, is a political ideal, in that a good sovereign who sets the example, paying by his own person, embodying an example, a model, has nothing else to do but to be an embodiment of that example, and the sense of what is human and just will come about by itself. You have this other tile cap bearing another moral maxim in 4 characters, and it tells us that the voice and virtue will be placed in good order. Tao Te, you know, that's the other title that was given to the text of the Lao Tzu, meaning the Tao Te Ching, the canonical book of the way and its virtue. So here we have 2 notions which by themselves put themselves in proper order. So here we have this character, Shen, where you can maybe recognize, for those of you who have done a bit of Chinese, the 3 vertical lines, which taken in isolation are pronounced Chan, referring to a waterway. And this is why the Sichuan province is precisely the province of the 4 waterways or rivers. And this notion of Chen means that you're going in the direction of the water. The text of the Lu Yu that we're examining is to be re-examined, revisited, in light of the work carried out by philologists and archaeologists together. In other words, it must be reread not as a text by an author or as the outcome of a continuous process of stratification and textual sedimentation. We saw this last year. Some even speak of an accretion, but it should be viewed rather as the concretion of mobile textual units that are found in different sources, and the different contexts give them a scope and the meaning, which vary. Now, this question would lead us to a hypothesis that we will be investigating in the remaining lectures. A hypothesis according to which the Analects of Confucius cannot be formed as a book, as a more or less stable textual entity before the early Han period. Here I'm showing you once again this table showing historical milestones, where in red I put the conventional dates for Confucius. Confucius, therefore, is said to have lived between the 6th and the 5th century before the Christian era, from 551 to 479. At the bottom of the table, we have the milestones for the Han Dynasty, which took place clearly several centuries after Confucius's lifetime. Here, too, by convention, the Han Dynasty dates from 206 BC up to 220 after Jesus Christ. So, these questions lead us to the hypothesis that the Lu Yu could not have been formed as a book before the early Han, or, in other words, the first part of the Han Dynasty, before the later Han, the 1st and 2nd century, let's say, after Jesus Christ. In other words, the period when the new socio-political order begins to be instituted in a centralized empire. I believe that the question that we will be investigating, and I believe I'll be stopping here for today, because I must admit that I'm beginning to have my eyes getting tired, and I think you are probably getting tired of listening to my very hesitant way of speaking. So the big question for us will be to see to what extent the text of the Lu Yu and even the character Confucius himself are, to say things quite brutally, to what extent they're not a Han invention. In other words, let's say a construction, not entirely made from scratch, but we could say an ideological construction that was devised to serve the needs of a new imperial order, the order of a centralized empire. And this is truly a question that all the deconstructionists we have reviewed until now ask themselves. But at the same time, it should be considered very seriously, especially as it is clearly directly linked to very contemporary concerns with the instrumentalization of Confucius and the character Confucius and the famous return of Confucius, which we are currently observing in mainland China today, and which was our starting point. So thank you once again for attending today, and I hope to see you next week without any more tile caps or tiles on my head before the end of the lecture.